When Germany tried to take over Europe, an alliance of basically the whole rest of the world had to ally against it. Today, even though Germany is largely disarmed, it's still the main power broker behind the European Union. All of this basically means that the inner power of the German nation is tremendous. Until recently, I largely looked past Germany's potential as a future power. However, I've come to realize that I may have not given the country enough credit. This is a video to analyze how possible a future German empire is. The answers may surprise you either way. Germany was created in the late 19th century when Europe was largely ruled over by kings and noblemen, and you can take part of that great tradition with established titles. Established Titles is a company that will sell you a lordship. No, I'm not messing with you. They will sell you a 1 square foot plot of land in Scotland, which you can now become a lord from, and that's a really cool thing to tell your friends at a party. All of this is official, so you can put it on plane tickets, credit cards, or dating app profiles. You can even purchase the land in pairs so that you and your partner can have land right next to each other, which is really romantic for Valentine's Day that's coming up. I mean, on my side, as you can see, I'm Lord Woodefaltist, which I think is pretty fitting because I'm actually descended from Scottish nobility. Something else that's really cool is that Established Titles is also environmental, in that once you buy the land in Scotland, they'll use it to plant trees around the world. Right now, Established Titles is doing a massive Valentine's Day sale just for you guys. In addition to that, if you go onto their website by clicking the link in the description and use the promo code WOODEFALTIST, you can get 10% off any purchases you make. So click the link in the description and become a lord today with Established Titles. Germany is a nation that's geopolitically stuck with a bunch of different contradictions. One of these being the European Union. Europe is a continent that spent over 1,000 years fighting itself in bitter wars that built extremely strong national identities, but the European Union is there to try to paper that over with bureaucratic procedures. However, treaties can't just get rid of centuries of deep cultural and political differences. Germany, due to its sheer size, alongside the dynamic and hard-working nature of its people, is the main power behind the European Union. It's in what really amounts to be an alliance with France in order to keep the European Union, with France providing the military power and diplomatic ability, while Germany supplies raw strength and energy. Just as an example to show how the European order works is Greece. In that the Greeks, being financially irresponsible Mediterraneans, got into far more debt than they could really deal with, backed by the euro, a currency that was made artificially strong by Germany and other northern European countries. However, since the Germans and other culturally similar Germanic North European countries are Europe's bank, while the south of the continent's more financially irresponsible, a bailout of Greece would have come disproportionately from the Germans. The Germans, meanwhile, blocked a bailout for years from the Central European government, since the financial irresponsibility of the Greeks was offensive to them. I do really sympathize with the Germans here, but this brings the main problem of a German-controlled Europe, in that the main flaw of the German nation on the international scale is inflexibility and the inability to sympathize with other countries and see their perspective. The Germans have had a tendency across their history to do what they want without consulting other countries and act as if it's a general moral good in of itself that other nations are wrong for being against. In the case of Greece, even though the Greeks were in the wrong, if Greece went bankrupt, it would have probably triggered a financial collapse across the whole south of Europe that would have brutally hurt the entire European economy and the euro as a currency. Another example of this common German-European situation being Yugoslavia, in which in the Civil War in the 1990s, the US conceded the crisis to the Europeans, who had been asking for greater autonomy for decades. But Europe did nothing for weeks as tens of thousands died, since the Germans were emboldened by their Catholic parties that were sympathetic to the Croats. Both of these bring us to a major point, that the German-dominated European Union world is allowed by the Americans. The Americans managed the negotiations over Greece and were also the ones that stepped in during Yugoslavia, bombing the Serbs and ending the crisis. Europe as a central trade and political system cannot operate without the Americans watching over, since due to centuries of conflict, the Europeans don't trust each other to rule the other without the Americans to arbitrate. The US has bailed out Europe in nearly every crisis since the Second World War, whether with the Cold War, the 2008 financial crash, literally bailing out the European economy there, Putin's recent encroachments in Eastern Europe, Yugoslavia, or Greece. Very few European countries, with Germany as the flagship example, have strong militaries, with the US protecting Europe. This allows pan-European unity since no one's afraid of anyone else's military. Germany benefits immensely from this pan-European system since they're the most economically developed area in Europe and so can treat the rest of Europe as a market while not incurring the political or military costs of the region, which are paid for by the US. I've covered it indirectly in a couple videos, and I'm going to make a video soon directly about it, but Europe and the whole world in general is about to have a large political, social, and economic crisis. We see world crises roughly every 250 years that kill between 1/3 to half of the world's population. I don't know if it's going to be that bad this time, and our current era lines up for one of these crises by so many different metrics. This is caused by a confluence of demographic and political factors, of which here's a text wall to explain, but in Europe's case is largely caused by three things. The first being demographics, in that most European countries, with Germany being an example, will have populations that will halve over the next 2 generations. We've never seen anything like this before, and the effects of rapid population decline rippling across the whole society will be horrifying. The second is political, in that the US, as mentioned before, Europe's guardian, is having a political crisis itself that forces it to turn its own attentions inward, thus allowing instability in Europe. And third being that most major countries in Europe, with Germany being a lesser case, are printing money at some of the highest rates ever in history. Inflation and debt to this degree always provoke social collapses without exception. This will cause a crisis in Europe, which will likely manifest mainly in crippling economic recessions, which will provoke social tensions. Things once considered unimaginable in the continent, whether people not eating meat on a regular basis, Scotland or Catalonia seceding, or far-right anti-democratic parties seizing power, will become the norm. I don't know directly how this would manifest. There could be a war with Russia or China, or massive state collapses in Africa for all I know. Once you get really high amounts of chaos in a system, which occurs with stuff like this, specifics get hard. For example, I'm unclear what politics Germany would get. I think the Nazi memory is too strong for Germany to go hard right, and Germany would almost certainly be more economically stable than the rest of Europe due to their greater financial restraint and the overall strength of their economy, so Germany would probably remain more centrist than the rest of the European continent. America, dealing with its own conflict between right and left, will not be able to intervene and manage Europe in an effective way. When you see that the 2008 financial crash nearly tore a centralized Europe apart, and since then the EU has become weaker and this crash will almost certainly be more powerful, I see no way the European Union survives as a centralized organization. Thus, Europe will split into a bunch of different directions, with the UK probably becoming an American client state, the French gaining influence over Latin Europe, and the Scandinavian countries being pretty self-sufficient as is, but the Germans would preside over their own zone of influence in Eastern Europe. As of now, France and Germany are pivotal allies, and I don't think this is going to survive in the post-European Union world because both countries' geographies and self-interests are inherently different. France is split between being a Mediterranean and Atlantic country with interests in southern Europe and an economy that's heavily divorced from the rest of the European system. Meanwhile, Germany is a continental power on the North European plain with interests mostly in Eastern Europe. And both countries are pretty culturally different as well, and I think largely the reason they've been working together for so long is that they want to put up a facade of being friends because their rivalry during the World Wars was so horrifying, and modern Europe tries to do everything to escape the memory of the World Wars. This crisis will in many ways give Germany opportunity to become a great power. Chaos always allows an immense amount of opportunities for change, and if the Germans play their cards right, they could end up being far more powerful. Most people don't know this, but much of Eastern Europe is effectively a German economic colony. Countries like the Baltic, Poland, Hungary, Romania, etc. have been modernized since the time of the fall of the Soviet Union, using German money with the factories there being run by German companies. East Central Europe is the area of the world with the fastest collapsing populations anywhere, with some countries going to lose half of their population in the next few decades. Many of the young people in these countries, meanwhile, are immigrating to Germany, assimilating, and those that return to their home countries bringing back German culture. This might be a harsh way of phrasing it, but countries like Latvia or Slovakia make sense in a world where transportation is done by horse or mule, but in a world of train, automobile, and the internet, it would be surprising that these small countries without geographic boundaries don't end up getting assimilated over the next couple centuries. And that's what might happen in the next few decades with East Central Europe assimilating to German culture. When you look at the eras of massive cultural compression, it's those of large population change, and the next few decades will be an era of massive demographic change around the world. The fate of East Central Europe has always been determined by the political winds of regions far away, and that's still the case here. This German Empire is just as unlikely as it is likely. Germany might collapse into its own internal tensions, for example, and be unable to move outwards. Likewise, after the painful World War II memories, the Germans might not be able to act effectively militarily. Another important thing to consider is that the Germans have an extremely weak military for a nation of their importance, and if Eastern and Central Europe become a lot more chaotic and require a military, the Germans just don't have it, and I have complete faith the Germans could build an excellent military if they wanted to quickly, but if they have to act quickly, then they just can't, and their military would end up being a handicap. The powers East Central Europe are dependent upon this time are Russia, America, Germany, and Poland, with each having the opportunity for leadership. Russia's really the wild card, and that as we're seeing, Russia might want to roll through Eastern Europe, in which case the fortunes of strategic decisions in that war become decisive. If Russia wins, Russia controls Eastern Europe. Easy. Other scenarios in that war could have Poland becoming strong from becoming the anvil of the anti-Russian alliances, or Poland being weakened from the war, thus making Germany more powerful. In my opinion, Russia, a country with some of the worst demographics of anywhere, alongside an already extremely fragile economic, political, and social system, will collapse over the next few decades. If Russia falls apart, either the Poles or Germans would benefit depending upon who mobilizes the leadership in that area. The American allied nations in the region like Hungary, Romania, the Baltics, etc. are either going to go for one of those two countries, and that's largely dependent upon the competency of the German leadership and who America backs most effectually. Germany has much more power, but also over double Poland's population. But these countries also like Poland more than the Germans because the Germans have a reputation for being a bit overbearing and genocidal. We already see a bit of a preference with Poland with the alliance that formed against Russia that was masterminded by the Americans with Poland as the leading linchpin. However, when the real battle comes, the Germans might end up on top. As shown before, the Americans will support the Poles if given the choice, since they're the weaker one, and America and Poland have a very good relationship. However, the actual amount of help America can give is an inverse relationship to how stuck America is in its own internal politics. In every one of the world crises, Eastern Europe is fought over bitterly, whether in the World Wars, Napoleonic Wars, or the 17th century. This time will be no different, except that this time it will probably be a lot less bloody, since no one can afford to lose their young men with collapsing populations. Instead, there's going to be a lot of blockades, riots, failed states, and yes, still, of course, wars. As I said before, I'm not entirely sure how the geopolitical turmoil in this region would play out, but I'm pretty sure it will. I've kind of left a murky picture here, and that's intentional. Due to the sheer amount of players involved in the flat geography, Eastern Europe is one of the hardest places to predict in the world. I mean, even in the 20th century, you could have easily had a region dominated by the Kaiser, Nazis, Soviets, Tsar, Americans, or locals, with each being plausible options. Is Germany a long-term empire option? I would say I'm generally doubtful, in that I wouldn't put them in my top tier of list of powers of this century. This is partially since I'm not bullish on Europe in general. This is in large part because I think Europe's lost a lot of initiative since the Second World War. Name a single great invention, philosopher, or artist that's come out of Europe in the last 80 years. 80% of European billionaires inherited money, 80% of American billionaires are self-made. And I don't even have to bring up areas of the world like Asia, who is rising precipitously in economic and political importance, or Africa, who will possibly see its population quadruple over the next century, to see power is leaving Europe. This stands against a Europe's population that is supposed to halve before the end of the century. As the Nazis believed, Germany's ability to be a great power is dependent upon their ability to stake out control of Eastern Europe, because otherwise it's just too small a country to compete in a world of continent-sized nations. This is possible, but as said before, is highly dependent upon Germany's leadership and historical chance. This leads me to a final and important point, that Germans really need to believe in something to die for in order to make their empire work, and I think this is the biggest thing holding them back. Germans are polled as one of the countries in the whole world where people desire to fight for their nation the least. Germans have thrown away belief in God, communism, nationalism, and basically anything to mobilize their people. The Germans would have to invent something totally new in order to arouse their nation, and I don't see anyone trying that. Ideas and culture matter. Just look at how the nomadic horse tribes were able to conquer India and China with populations 1/100th of the conquered. The Romans conquered a massive empire, but their descendants grew weak and they were conquered by barbarians who they easily outnumbered by over a factor of 10 to 1. When I look at Germany, I see a country that is entirely pushed for pacifism in its culture, and thus lost the mettle that it takes to forge an empire. What a faultist, and thanks for watching. If you enjoyed that video, please like, comment, subscribe, or stay tuned for additional content. Or alternatively, check out my various social medias or my Patreon, where I've got the first couple hundred pages of my cultural history of America and history of the world. As always, thanks so much for watching, and have a great day.